There's a feeling that appears throughout ordinary human life. Sometimes it shows up as restlessness, sometimes as tension, sometimes as uncertainty, sometimes as a sense that something is missing. The form changes, the circumstances change, but the experience itself is familiar to almost everyone, a feeling of not being completely settled. And because this feeling can be uncomfortable, a very natural interpretation often follows. Something must be wrong. Something must be missing. Something still needs attention. And at first, this conclusion can seem reasonable. Because the feeling keeps repeating, it only seems logical to assume that it's pointing towards a problem. Something that might need to be solved, something that may need to be corrected. And so attention turns towards identifying what's wrong, what's missing, what still needs improvement. And because this interpretation feels so obvious, it's rarely questioned. It simply appears self-evident. The feeling is here. Therefore, something must need fixing. And over time, an interesting pattern begins to emerge. The feeling appears. A problem is identified. Correction begins. Progress is made. Relief follows. And eventually, the feeling returns again. Not necessarily in the same form, not always attached to the same circumstances, but recognizable. And when this feeling returns, it activates the same interpretation. Something still isn't resolved. Something still needs attention. And so the process continues. You look for something more to improve. Another search, another attempt to finally reach that point where this feeling disappears. And because each cycle contains moments of genuine progress and temporary relief, the interpretation becomes increasingly convincing. The process appears to be working until the feeling returns once more. And eventually something begins to stand out. Not simply the feeling itself, but the way it's being understood. Because throughout the entire process, one assumption remains largely untouched. The assumption that the feeling of ordinary unease is evidence of a problem, that it's pointing towards something that needs correction, something that needs to be resolved. And what if that assumption is mistaken? What if ordinary unease is not functioning as evidence that something is wrong? What if the feeling has been misinterpreted from the very beginning? Because if ordinary unease is repeatedly mistaken as a deficiency, then an entire project naturally emerges around correcting that perceived deficiency. The attempt to search for answers, the effort to improve, the attempt to finally become complete, the hope to eventually arrive. And once that project begins, life naturally organizes around it. Not because growth is mistaken, not because people are irrational, but because the interpretation that was made for them from the beginning was seen as true. And once that process unfolds, something else happens, a pattern that we've spoken of. The feeling appeared, a problem was assumed, and correction followed. From that point forward, the process unfolds naturally, which suggests a possibility that is rarely considered. The issue may not be the feeling itself. The issue may be the diagnosis, the interpretation, the meaning assigned to ordinary unease. Because if that diagnosis is mistaken, then every effort built upon that diagnosis will naturally move in the same direction, toward the same correction, toward completion, toward becoming that version of yourself that will finally feel settled. And if the feeling of ordinary unease continues to appear throughout life, then the project can continue indefinitely. Not because correction is failing, but because the process itself was organized around a misunderstanding from the very beginning. This is what I mean by the misdiagnosis of unease. The interpretation of ordinary unease as evidence that something is wrong, missing, or deficient. And although the phrase may be new, the experience itself is not. In fact, we've been exploring its consequences throughout this channel. The endless search for answers, the inability to fully arrive, the self-improvement cycle, the process of experiencing yourself as an ongoing project, the sense of something missing. These may not be separate problems. They may be expressions of the same underlying misunderstanding. And so, if that's true, a new question may naturally emerge. Not, what else do I need to fix about myself? But, what if this feeling that started this entire project of self-correction was never evidence of a problem in the first place? And that's something we will definitely continue to explore together.